All right, so now that we've looked at how the cell membrane is able to transport molecules across the cell membrane, how the cell membrane is able to do its job based off of its structure, we're going to be looking at two different examples of when the cell uses cell transport. So when it's using membranes to move molecules across the cell. The first example we're going to talk about is photosynthesis. The second example we're going to talk about, which is going to be a different video, is cellular respiration. So before we get started with photosynthesis, I am going to be showing you a Bill Nye video where he performs, or people in his show perform, a few experiments to kind of get us thinking about how people discovered this process of photosynthesis.
So far, we've seen discoveries that revealed the biology of life on the microscopic level. Our next great discoveries opened our eyes to the biology of the macro, those systems on which all life on the planet depends. The year is 1771. Chemist Joseph Priestley conducts a series of experiments to see what happens when he heats various substances in closed jars and collects any gases coming off. In one of the experiments, he put a lit candle under the jar, but the flame quickly burned out. In Priestley's words, the air inside was injured. Curious what effect this injured air might have on a living thing, he placed a mint leaf inside the jar and left it there for 10 days. When Priestley checked back, incredibly, the leaf was still green. Somehow the air inside the jar was fresh again. Priestley speculated that the mint leaf must be responsible for this transformation. But how? This question remained unanswered until a Dutch scientist named Jan Ingenhousz decided to duplicate Priestley's experiments. Using plants, Ingenhousz witnessed the same beguiling phenomenon. After conducting a series of more tests, Ingenhousz began to realize what was happening. The ability of a plant to transform the air inside the jar only worked if the plant was exposed to sunlight. This was the breakthrough. Together, Priestley and Ingenhousz had discovered photosynthesis, the biochemical process by which plants trap the energy of sunlight and convert it into chemical energy. Photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and replenishes it with the gas on which our survival depends, oxygen. The same gas that Joseph Priestley would discover 3 years later in 1774.
Hopefully you can gather that photosynthesis takes place in plants. We figured out that the plants will use carbon dioxide and they will make oxygen. So that's what those experiments were. Hopefully from that video you were able to gather a little bit of information about photosynthesis. It takes place in plants, it uses carbon dioxide, it makes oxygen, and when we think about it, or hopefully you were able to gather from that video that photosynthesis takes place in plants, it uses carbon dioxide, and then it makes oxygen. So keep in mind that we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants use our carbon dioxide and they make us oxygen. So let us talk about two different types of organisms real quick. We can use the word autotroph to describe plants. So auto means self, troph means energy. You are making energy on your own for yourself. You're able to make your own food using sunlight. So that's describing photosynthesis. The example is plants. That's what we're going to be talking about with photosynthesis. The word heterotrophs, hetero means other, troph again still means energy. So these are organisms that can't make their own food. They have to eat food. They have to get their energy from somewhere other than themselves. The example would be humans. We are heterotrophs. We have to eat food in order to get energy. So for photosynthesis, we are going to be talking about autotrophs. When we do get to cellular respiration, we are going to be talking about both autotrophs and heterotrophs. So both plants and animals will go through cellular respiration. However, we're sticking to photosynthesis for right now. Right here, come on. So photosynthesis essentially is using sunlight to eventually produce ATP, which we then use to make sugar or glucose. Like I said, we use carbon dioxide, we use water, and we also produce oxygen as well as that sugar, as well as that glucose. So another way to look at it is that we are using sunlight and converting it to sugar. Let's pause for a second, okay? So like I said, we are using carbon dioxide. These two things mean the same thing, they're just written differently. So we are using carbon dioxide, we are using water, and then using light energy, so using sunlight, we're able to convert these molecules into glucose or sugar and oxygen. So if we think about it, we would not be alive today without plants. The world as we know it would not exist without plants. So not only are plants making oxygen, which is super important for our atmosphere, it's also the air that we breathe. Basically, most of the organisms on this planet need oxygen in order to survive, but they are also making the primary food source on this planet. So plants make glucose, they make sugar. Everything that we eat, we either eat a plant or we are eating something that eats a plant, or we can eat something that eats something else that eats a plant. So everything except plants need plants in order to survive. It gives us the air that we breathe and the food that we eat. So this process is very crucial for the survival of this planet as we know it. Not to be dramatic, but I am being dramatic because it's that important. So for the Bio MCAS, if you are responsible for passing the Bio MCAS, you do need to memorize this equation. You can memorize it in word format or written in this shorthand format. Either one is okay. This is something that needs to be tattooed on the inside of your eyelids. It will come up on the MCAS. You need to know the reactants. The reactants are the ingredients, what we start with. So the reactants are carbon dioxide and water. The products, that's what we end with. That's what we're making. The products are glucose and oxygen. Now, photosynthesis, it is a two-step process. The first step is called the light reaction. The second step is called the Calvin cycle. We're not going to be going into too much detail about what happens in those steps, but we will have to keep track of the reactants and the products of the light reaction, and we will have to keep track of the reactants and the products of the Calvin cycle. The last piece of important information is that photosynthesis takes place inside the chloroplast of a plant cell. That usually does come up on the MCAS. You need to know that plants contain chloroplasts. Chloroplast is where photosynthesis takes place. So let's take a look at the structure of a chloroplast. This picture right here is meant to help us out, so we can see that this is a chloroplast. Also important, notice that these are green right here. So the chloroplast is responsible for the reason why plants are green. And again, I'll come back to that and explain that in the next couple slides. So the three parts that we need to know about are the thylakoids or the thylakoid membrane, the grana, and the stroma. So the thylakoid or the thylakoid membrane are the system of membranes that are arranged into flattened sacs. So that's like these little what are they, like green pancakes stacked on top of each other? That's what the thylakoid is right here. So we can see the arrow. It's literally the like pancake itself. This thylakoid membrane is the location of the light reaction. So the light reaction is taking place inside this membrane of the thylakoid. So remember when we talked about cell transport, things are moving across a cell membrane. The light reaction depends on these molecules moving across the thylakoid membrane. Now, the grana are the like stacks of thylakoid. So you can see right here, this is one granum. All of these are grana. So it's like the stacks of green pancakes together. The last part of the chloroplast that we need to talk about is the stroma. That's just sort of the solution and the space around the grana that we see. And this is also the location of the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle was step 2 in photosynthesis. Yep, so I was just looking at my other slides to make sure, but I do want to come back to the thylakoids. They have a specific molecule in them called chlorophyll. That is a green pigment. So remember, that's why plants are green. They have something called chlorophyll, which is inside the thylakoid of the chloroplast. It is a green pigment, which is why plants are green. It's also very important in the light reaction. So let's talk about the light reaction, okay? This is when we absorb light energy from the sun. That's why it's called the light reaction. And basically, we are able to take that solar energy and convert it into chemical energy, convert it into ATP. Like I said, this takes place in the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast, and it is using chlorophyll in order to capture the sunlight. As far as reactants and products go, this again right here is something that you need to tattoo on the inside of your eyelids. The reactants, the things that you start with, the ingredients of the light reaction are sunlight and water. And in this process, we are making the products are oxygen and then ATP and another energy molecule called NADPH. So what we are seeing here is that we are using sunlight, which is kind of one of our reactants. We are also using water, which is one of our reactants. And then we are also making one of our products, oxygen. So the only product we still need to make is glucose, which will take place in the Calvin cycle. Now, for the light reaction, like I said, chlorophyll is a very important molecule in this process. It is a green pigment. And basically, this right here in this diagram, this is chlorophyll right here. So it's kind of like a pigment. It kind of acts like a protein as well. But basically, it's responsible for absorbing the light energy. And then once it has that extra energy, it has this extra energy, so it gets like excited, we call it. And through that excitement, it is able to split a water molecule. So H2O, we split 2 water molecules. So we get 2 oxygens. They bind together. That oxygen can then go into the atmosphere and we get to breathe it in. But in the process of splitting water, it also emits an electron, which is able to pass through what we call the electron transport chain. We are transporting an electron through a chain of events. So the electron is able to pass through these different proteins or more chlorophyll until it reaches an important protein and an important enzyme called ATP synthase. So synthesis means to make. Synthase is an enzyme that makes ATP. So this is where we are making ATP in the light reaction. And this is all because of chlorophyll. So we are on this planet. This planet is the way that it is. We are living. All the other organisms on this planet are living because of chlorophyll. That's what's able to capture the sunlight. It's sort of like the solar panels of the biological world. So in step 2 of photosynthesis, we are talking about the Calvin cycle. If you remember, this does take place in the stroma of the chloroplast, just that space in between the grana. So this is when we are using that ATP and NADPH that we made in the light reaction. And now is when we're also going to be using the carbon dioxide, so the air that we breathe out. So basically using carbon dioxide as a building block and using some energy to help us break the carbon dioxide apart and reform different molecules in a specific process, eventually what we are able to do is make glucose or make sugar. So the idea here is that we have this new reactant, which is one of our reactants for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, and then we are using the ATP and the NADPH that was made in the light reaction. And with, like I said, the carbon dioxide, these building blocks, using the energy, we are able to reform it into glucose, the last product of photosynthesis. This diagram is meant to show you how this process takes place. Like I said, it's not super important for you to know the steps for the MCAS, but if you are curious, it is here for you to look at. The Calvin cycle can also be known as the light independent reaction. It's independent if sunlight is there, or the dark reaction because it can take place at night. So the light reaction can only take place during the day because it can only take place with sunlight. However, we can build up like a stash of ATP and NADPH as well as carbon dioxide and continue the Calvin cycle 24/7. So it can happen day or night. And then I already talked about this, but just to reinforce this idea, why is photosynthesis important? Number one, it's going to recycle the air that we use. So it uses carbon dioxide, the air that we breathe out, and then it makes us more oxygen, the air that we breathe in. Like I said, it also creates the primary food source for all living things on this planet, which means that life on this planet would not survive, would not exist without the process of photosynthesis, specifically without the pigment of chlorophyll. So let's take a moment and appreciate chlorophyll for giving us life. All right, so take a moment, like I said, pause, make sure that you are filling in your vocab notebook. And again, open up your slide deck, click through the slides. You can check out all the different definitions, and then also check in with yourself. Make sure you are memorizing the equation for photosynthesis. This is known as the equation for photosynthesis. You need to know the reactants, which are the ingredients, the things that you start with. You need to know the products, the things that you make or the things that you end with. Also, you need to keep track of, for each process, what the reactants of that process are and what the products of that process are. So this would be the light reaction. And then again, for the Calvin cycle, you need to know the reactants of the Calvin cycle and then the products of the Calvin cycle. So let's just review really quick. The carbon dioxide is a reactant of the Calvin cycle. Water is a reactant of the light reaction. Light energy is used in the light reaction. Glucose is a product of the Calvin cycle, and oxygen is a product of the light reaction. ATP and NADPH are products of the light reaction, and then they're immediately used as reactants in the Calvin cycle. So it kind of cancels itself out in terms of ending up in this equation right here. So, like I said, check out your vocab notebook, stay up to date, get it done, and we will talk about cell respiration in the next video.